If we have a data with blank rows, we can certainly remove them manually by selecting each row at a time. Or we can have them removed automatically using dynamic formulas. In today's video, we are learning 4 dynamic formulas to automatically remove blank rows for us. Let's get started. To remove blank rows from the data, start by selecting the cell, press equals, type filter, press tab to insert the filter function. Select the data that includes blank rows, press comma, and remember for the include argument, we only want to show the rows that are not empty. So select the data again, not equal to sign, double quotation to represent empty rows, close bracket, and hit enter, and there you have the data or the result without blank rows. Remember, we are using dynamic array function and it automatically updates to remove blank rows if the source data changes. Let's quickly understand why this formula is working by understanding the criteria we used. Basically, we checked the entire data to see which of the rows had values and which ones are empty. The rows that contained values returned true, whereas the empty ones returned false. Using the same logic, filter function can include only those rows out of the entire dataset that return true. Therefore, the ones that returned false were excluded from the results, and that's how blank rows were eliminated from the output. And as I said before, the formula is dynamic and it can automatically update if the source data changes and removes blank rows dynamically and automatically for us. Now let's have a look at another set of data with blank rows, but this time instead of a single column, we have multiple columns. Again, start by selecting the cell, press equals, filter, press tab to insert the filter function, select the entire dataset, press comma. Now for the include argument, as we can see the blank rows span across the entire dataset uniformly, we can use any of the columns to check for the empty rows. Going with the same criteria we used in the last example, select the first column, not equals to, double quotation for the empty rows, close bracket, hit enter, and there you have the entire datasets with blank rows removed. This approach, however, falls apart very quickly if the column selected is not uniformly blank with respect to the other columns in the data. For example, if I add dates to the first column, we can see that now we have the data that wasn't intended in the final output. So instead of relying on a single column, we must check all of the columns in the data to correctly identify the blank rows. Once again, we have a similar data, but this time around, instead of checking only the first column or one of the columns, we will be checking all of the columns individually to identify and remove the blank rows. In other words, we will check the first column and the second column and the third column and the fourth column to output results without any blank rows.
I know, you must be thinking it's super impractical to select each and every column in the data range, and quite frankly it is. But to understand the concept behind the easy way that's coming up next, we got to go through the long way at least once, so keep watching.
In short, our criteria will be based on AND logic. Let's see how it's done. Select the cell, press equals, filter, press tab to insert the filter function, select the range, comma, open bracket, select the first column, not equals to sign, double quotes, close bracket, and this completes the criteria statement for the first column. We need to repeat the same for each of the columns in the data. Now remember, our criteria is based on AND logic, and in case of filter function, AND argument or AND logic is represented by a star sign or asterisks. So insert star, open bracket. Now we can proceed to the second column, not equals to, double quotes, and finish the statement by inserting the closing bracket. For the third and the fourth column, we simply need to repeat the same steps. Once all of the columns are included, close bracket, hit enter, and we can see the output is now without any blank rows. Now, one can think, why don't we just select all of the columns at once instead of going the hard way to select each column separately? Well, we can know only by doing it, so let's give it a try. Remove the existing results, equals, filter, select the range, comma, select the entire range again, not equals to, double quotes, closing bracket, hit enter, and this runs into a value error. So let's understand why this happened and then how to solve it. In our last filter formula, we used this criteria. To understand why this resolved into an error, let's run this separately and see what really happens. Equals A3 D14, which is effectively the range of the data, not equals to, double quotes, enter, and now here we can see that it has produced a two-dimensional array. Now, although filter function is a dynamic array function, but as of now, Excel dynamic array functions can only take one-dimensional array. This criteria is spelling multiple values along the rows and multiple values along the columns. We can convert this two-dimensional array into one-dimensional array by using AND function. Let's understand it step by step. AND function will return true only if all of the arguments are true, and it will result into a false even if one of the argument is false. Now in our case, AND function will return true only if all of the cells in a row contain a value. And even if one cell is empty, it will result into a false. Let's see how it's done. Equals, and press tab to insert the AND function. Select the first row, closing bracket, enter, and it has resulted into true because all of the arguments were true. Let's apply this for the entire range. Control enter, and here we can see for the third row it has produced a false result. Reason being, the third row had 3 empty cells that resulted in false, and as we said, even if one of the argument is false, and will result into a false. Now that we have this result, this is not an array yet. To convert this result into a one-dimensional array, we need to use by-row function. By-row function, as the name suggests, applies a specific function to each individual row of the selected range. Let's see how it works in our situation. Select the cell, equals, by-row. For the array, it is our actual data. And we want to check each row of this selected data for non-empty cells. So again, not equals to, empty. And we want to test this using AND logic. So we'll insert AND, closing bracket, press enter. And now you can see that we have the same results as we had in this column using AND function, but this time our result is a one-dimensional array. Now this serves us two purposes. One, that it has converted two-dimensional array into a one-dimensional array that we can use in other dynamic array functions. And secondly, it has saved us from manually inserting AND function for each individual row. Now let's take this up into our filter function. Let's copy the formula we need for our filter function. Control C, escape, select the cell, equals, filter, press tab to insert the filter function. For array, we will select the original data, comma, Control V to insert the by-row function we just created, closing bracket, press enter, and there you have it. With a much shorter and simpler formula, we extracted only such rows that have complete records. Now we can run into a situation where we want to keep the partially complete rows but still exclude completely blank rows. Let's see how it's done. In order to extract both complete and partially complete rows but still excluding the completely blank rows, instead of using AND logic or AND function, we can use OR logic or OR function. The main difference between AND and OR logic is that in case of AND function, remember we said that it returns true only if all of the arguments are true and will return false even if one of the argument is false. Now in case of OR function, it returns true even if one of the argument is true and will return false if all of the arguments are false. So let's run the OR function in our situation. OR, select the first row, closing bracket, press enter. Let's run it for the entire range, control enter. And there you have it. We can see that it returned false only when all of the arguments are false and return true even if one of the argument is true. Using this logic in our filter function, we will be able to extract even partially complete rows. But again, we need to convert this into an array first, and for that we need to use byrow function. So equals byrow, select the data range, not equal to empty, and this time instead of inserting AND function we will have OR function. Closing bracket, press enter, and there you can see that it has returned the same results that we had here. Copy this formula, select the cell, filter, select the range, comma, paste the function that we just created, closing bracket, press enter, and there you have it. Now we have extracted not only the complete rows but also the partially complete rows, but excluded the two blank rows from our records. So there you have it, removing blank rows made simple for you. I am Hassan Fazal. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share this video, and we will meet in the next one.